So welcome everyone to our first School of Design Talks series for the 2020-2021 academic year. I am Christina Harrington, an assistant professor in the School of Design. I am co-chair of the School of Design Talks with Lara Rossi Garcia this year. And we are excited to have all of you with us. We have a really great lineup of designers, academics, researchers, practitioners that will be speaking across the academic year this year. To kind of kick off our School of Design Talk series, Dr. Denise Naku will be giving a welcome. She is the director of the School of Design. And so I will turn it over to Denise.
Thank you, Christina. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Denise Naku, director of the School of Design. I'm very excited to see this group gathered here today from near and far. I'm very excited for the opportunity to come together and to learn. I would like to extend on behalf of our faculty a warm welcome to our honored guest, Ari Melenciano. I'm super excited for you to be here and as Christina said, to kick off our speaker series. And I'm just very happy that you're here with us. I also want to acknowledge Christina and Laura for their work, for Janet Hill, who is our graduate assistant, helping with the talks, for putting together this event and for our series. I think it's really important in these times that we have these opportunities to learn about each other's work, to showcase the excellent work of those working in our field. So thank you for making that happen. That's it. I just want to welcome everyone and really looking forward to the talk. Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to jump in. But before I formally introduce Ari, I would like to share a little bit about our upcoming events. So let me share my screen real quick. I hope everyone can see it. So hello, welcome again, and thank you to everyone for attending our first event for the School of Design Talks this year. My name is Laura Rossi Garcia. I'm faculty in the School of Design, and I'm co-chairing the talks this year with Christina. I just wanted to take a moment to highlight one of our upcoming events, just about a week and a half from now, the 2020 Impact Grant Showcase, which will feature the work of 3 student group awardees of the 2020 Summer Impact Grant. This grant invited School of Design undergraduate students to imagine, develop, and deploy cutting-edge visual and interactive designs that have a positive cultural or social impact. The students' projects span graphic design, game design, and user experience design. And we're also very excited that Chicago-based user experience designer and co-founder of the Hue Summit, Randall Wilson, will be our keynote speaker for that event. In addition to Showcase, as Christina was mentioning, we have several talks and workshops slated for the rest of the academic year with a range of speakers across activism, emerging technologies, and design as a social response. I encourage you to follow our Eventbrite, Facebook, or Instagram to receive updates and register for upcoming events. And you can also find an archive of previous talks on our YouTube channel. So now, without further ado, I'd like to formally introduce Ari Melenciano. Ari is a creative technologist and researcher who is passionate about exploring the relationships between various forms of design and the human experience. Currently, her research lies at the intersections of human-computer interactive technologies, social impacts of technology, counterculture, sound, multisensory experiential design, experimental pedagogy, and speculative design. Adi is the founder of Afrotopia, a social institution fostering interdisciplinary innovation at the intersections of art, design, technology, Black culture, and activism. She also teaches creative technology and design at NYU and the Pratt Institute. So we are very excited again to have Adi here to share her work and research with us. So please join me in welcoming Adi Melenciano.
So it's great to be here. I'm excited to share and then have a conversation afterwards. I'll be talking about a few things like my work and building communities and just generally approaching design through an Omni-Specialized lens. And so to give there was a great introduction. Thank you, Laura. But to also kind of visualize where I stand or where I see myself in the world as far as engaging with my work. At the core, it's always, I've always been considered myself as an artist and growing up, and then have found design to be another way of communicating artistically into the world where it's able to interact with other people, and then using technology in creative ways to create this sort of relationship between media and people. So allowing for the sort of interactivity with technology. And then have found research to be a great space to dive into, to bring in how the world works and then translate that through my own visual language. I love being an educator and being inside of a classroom. And I think one of my favorite parts of being inside of a classroom is that I get to learn from the students that I have. So I feel like I'm always a student. And so I'll talk a bit about my electromedia experience, my research, and approach, how that then blends into my pedagogy, and then going into building Afrotopia. And so with my practice, I consider it to be electromedia, and that it's thinking about a variety of different mediums, but always infusing technology into it. And one of my first areas of engaging with electromedia was thinking about sound and how sound could be reimagined through technology. And one thing that I explored doing was, and coming from an art background, of how I love sculptures or architecture in general, but sculptures are more of like a miniature architectural form, and how they create these sort of spaces for the mind. And so I wanted to create these forms, and often thinking about how art can be something that's not just something to look at, but it can also be a sort of tool. And so merging in technology into these artistic forms to make them interactive. So as people engage with these art pieces, they serve some sort of function. And the function for me was always important, to bring in sound, of a lover of sound, finding ways that I could create art that was not just aesthetically oriented, but also produce something and allowed people to produce with the art. So creating a sort of relationship. I think for me, one of the biggest things about electromedia that I love is that it destroys the dichotomy between the artist and the audience, and that there's then a relationship where the audience could then become an artist within themselves and engaging with the artist's work. And so these are screenshots of the work of me building these sound sculptures, whereas you interact with them with a variety of different sensors, like soft ribbon potentiometer, or other sorts of potentiometers, or a light phototransistor of exposing light, and that light, the level of exposure, would then change the frequency and the amplitude of the sound. And this was in a time when I was still a student, so I was tasked with creating an entire audio-visual experience, or at the very least, it was supposed to be audio. There's a course called New Interfaces for Musical Expression. But I also wanted to think about the entire experience of what might someone feel in being in this space that I'm creating, by bringing in my sound sculptures, but also thinking about the visuals that someone might see as I'm playing these sounds, and the costume I'm wearing, and the set design. And so I designed my instruments. I was thinking a lot about, I had watched the Jimi Hendrix movie at the time and just loved the style of Jimi Hendrix. And I mean, even the cinematography in the movie, I really was drawn to that. So I wanted to kind of encapsulate that on stage and bring in this coolness of a guitar, but thinking of it differently with the way that technology can allow for new opportunities. And so I fabricated that using a variety of different materials, like wood and acrylic that was reflective, and just thinking of these like futuristic sort of designs, but that's reimagining technology. And I think that's a lot of where my engagement with tech comes from, of thinking about what has existed in the analog world, and then how can technology just enhance it and make it something that's even more fun to engage with. And so also building a drum machine. And so I was creating these sound machines where, as I interact with them, they would create a variety of experimental sounds. And then in performing on stage with them, for me, I was thinking a lot about culture in a race and a a more aesthetic and fun way before getting too political. And I was thinking about how I just wanted to be something that reflected the beauty of Black culture. And so behind me, I had media of a variety of different music videos and archival footage of things going on in the Black world, and combining that and creating this sort of audio-visual experience of bringing in sounds like a radio station and experimentalizing them, bring them all in and creating this audio-visual environment. And this is an area that I've engaged with a lot of, even beyond machines that I'm physically creating, bringing in a variety of different sound machines and creating these spaces where people are able to hear a bunch of different sound excerpts. Like I'll bring in maybe James Baldwin, a sound excerpt from there, and then maybe a song from 444 by Jay-Z, and just like create these audio visual experiences where as people are entering, I'm thinking a lot about almost experimental pedagogy of what paradigms could be shifted by the exposure of different facets of culture. And so I'll also grab a lot of footage from YouTube, and it's just kind of like this hypersensorial compilation of facets of Black culture with the live performance. And me centering myself in this entire experience, I think a lot about the design of watches that are translucent, of you being able to see all the different gears. And I love being able to see the inner workings of something. So me placing myself in the center, controlling everything that people are seeing and hearing, it reminds me of the experience of looking at a translucent watch and being able to see the inner workings of something. And so I've continued along these sound sculpture veins. I was thinking a lot about the future of culture when developing this work called electromedia synesthesio, and thinking about how oftentimes with Black cultural artifacts, they have such heavy stigmas, such negative stigmas and stereotypes. They're seen as unprofessional or whatever when worn on a Black body, but when someone else of not Black descent, not African descent, wears it, it's sort of like this oriental in some ways, or cool, or it just completely changes based on who's wearing it. And so for me, I'm thinking about how, as a Black person, I find a lot of beauty in bamboo earrings, or I really admire seeing people on the street wearing a do-rag because it's a cultural artifact. It carries so much with it. And so I'm thinking about recontextualizing these different cultural artifacts and placing them outside of spaces that people normally identify them, and then what is their experience when they engage with it. And so creating these sound sculptures based off of these variety of different cultural artifacts and placing them in entirely different new worlds, and thinking of what is the future of culture when we recontextualize it and take it out of its social context of the day. And so in doing that, I also infuse these pieces with technology. And so infusing them with technology, I'm then creating alternative experiences other than just being able to view them, but as you engage with them. So as you touch the braids, or as you touch the do-rag or the hair rollers, sound is infused inside of them. And this sound is all stemming from African drum pattern music. So again, creating this cohesive Black audiovisual experience. As you touch the braids or different artifacts, you're hearing these sounds and you're able to compose your own music and produce it. And also as you change the Afro pick, I also had technology infused into that, where it was almost a sort of DNA. And just as Afro picks carry their own DNA, as you change the different Afro picks, they would then change the visuals that are being projected on top of the wall. Another project that I did where I was thinking more politically and through a Black cultural lens was this one speculating on critical race theory, and kind of exploring how can I create an experiential design where people are engaging with critical race theory in a way where it doesn't feel like they're in a classroom, but it's more of an entire experience. And it's reflective of everyday experiences. And so this came about with me sitting in my living room, and in my older living room, I had lights that changed colors on one wall, and I had my art on another wall. And just seeing how the light on that, as it changed colors, my art would look completely different as far as because the light was changing the hues of the art, an entirely different visual experience. And so I wanted to mimic that by creating this visual technology where I bought a few different eyeglasses and I colored the eyeglass lens different hues. And as you wore these different eyeglass lenses, the hues that you were able to see through then changed the visual that you were seeing. And so for me, I was trying to encapsulate this experience of how, particularly in America, but I'm sure everywhere, you can see something on the street and based on your upbringing, you have an entirely different interpretation of what's happening on the street. So you may see a police officer arresting someone, and someone of different races or different backgrounds, social cultural backgrounds or socioeconomic backgrounds would have an entirely different interpretation of what's happening in that moment, even though they're standing side by side. And so I wanted to create an experience where people are looking at triggering and controversial sort of micro sentences, but there are expounded elements of that sentence that you can only see by the glasses that you're wearing. So as people wore different glasses, standing right next to each other, they were looking through literally different perspectives, and three different perspectives being one of someone that someone that might identify themselves as someone of an oppressed community, someone that would be considered an oppressor, and someone that would be kind of like a common day liberal. They think they understand what racism is, but they don't entirely understand the structure. So they say that they're colorblind, or they say that they're against racism, but their actions can actually still be as harmful as an oppressor. And so I also was doing this and thinking about cultural appropriation of how, for me, I'm a DJ and I love the entire art form of a DJ, but also watching the DJ culture in general, and seeing how, and a lot of cultural artifacts from the Black community just being extracted from their origins and their social context and meanings, and become this commodification and tool for exploitation. And DJ culture is definitely a tool that's been in that vein often. And so with this, I created, the way that people even enter this experience was by engaging with this iridescent, alluring, color-filled DJ turntable. But then as they put their headphones on and the glasses on and they turned the vinyl, they were forced to listen to these sounds of critical race theory from presenters like Kimberly Crenshaw or other people, or Manla Steinberg, and all the work that they have done in sharing research, and be immersed in the space. And so again, talking about how people are standing right next to each other and seeing entirely different things. So in that first slide that I had, where you have racism is good if you're wearing glasses, as someone that's of someone that thinks that they understand racism but doesn't entirely. Up top, you can vaguely sort of see it. It says, I don't think racism is good. And someone that is of an oppressed community, when they put the glasses on, the text that will be revealed based on the color of their lens would say, racism is good for my oppression. And it would continue and with other graphics. Another project that I was building was called Metamorphosis. And this was a more recent project where I was in my apartment and hearing a lot of protesting in the streets and chants of things like I can't breathe or no justice, no peace. And then also having conversations with people who were recognizing that these things that we're saying in protests, they are inevitably affirmations of the more we say it, the more it becomes real. And so we have to be very careful about the things that we do say. And I was thinking also about the effects of turmoil and pain on the body historically, and how in past revolutions we've dealt with so much as Black people, and how all of this has been ingrained in us in different forms, one being epigenetically, of how our DNA changes. It literally changes and restructures based on the experiences ancestrally and in our lifetimes. And so I wanted to create a space that was free, allow people to come in and engage with these different healing modalities, whether it's sound or visuals, and root it in different philosophies and technologies of different cultural groups. So I was blending Eastern philosophy and spiritual practices with African sonic practices, by fusing frequencies aligned with the different 7 core energy centers, which are also considered chakras in Eastern spirituality practices, and African drums, both pattern music, African drum pattern music, but also African drum instrumentation, like talking drums and the djembes, which have historically been used in sounds of a revolution. So how can I blend these two technologies that have been so powerful, but for what I could see have not been brought together to create this unified experience to heal people and hopefully create some sort of epigenetic reversing, a positive epigenetic experience. And so in doing research on studying how the different chakras have their own sound frequencies directly tied to each of them, and then producing music where I'm bringing in African drum pattern music into these frequency chakras, And then creating the space of a lot of my work, I'm thinking about architecture and design and psychogeography. So how might this experience be in navigating through this space where it doesn't create dissonance, but it creates some sort of harmony. And so then going into producing the music using a variety of different beat machines and synthesizers, especially to get the different frequencies. And then creating the space. And this was designed through 3D rendering. So designing the whole space and making it something that's hopefully creating a sort of ethereal, well-balanced, light sort of experience. And then as you move through this, creating it all, 3D rendering it, and then putting it into this web VR environment with spatialized sound. So as you get closer to these different spheres, you're able to hear the sound that I've produced, that I've put inside of these different spheres. And so I can show you a bit of the experience. Actually, I don't think I have the video here, but as you move through this space, as you get closer to those different spheres, which all are placed in the different chakra areas. So you have root, then you have sacral, and going forward, you'll hear sounds, and you can continue to loop through, the sounds loop, and you can remain in the space for as long as you want. And so as I've built with this past project, I was doing a lot of modular synthesizer sort of explorations. And one of my favorite parts, I mean, I just love engaging with the modular synthesizer because it just feels like this tangible way of interacting with sound, where you're turning all these different knobs and you're placing these different sound patches and creating very tangible relationships between controls and the outputs. And so another thing that I think often about is how modular synthesizers, the components of it are often called Euroracks, or at least the ones that the most popular ones. And naturally, in the way that I engage with my modular synthesizer, with the modular synthesizer, you buy a bunch of different pieces and then you create your own instrument. And the setup that I've created and the sound that always comes out of it is very polyrhythmic and Afrocentric. So to use a tool that's titled to be Eurorack, a Eurocentric tool, but to output constantly Afrocentric tools has been one of my favorite parts in engaging with it. But then I've also been thinking about how, especially in listening to hip hop and related genres, of just the way watching people, I mean, you go on TikTok and you just see people create these whole dances around this music. And culturally, there seems to be some sort of thread in the way that people move in relation to the sounds that they're hearing. Like, it seems to be pretty uniform. And so something I've been studying for a little while is, what is that relationship between sounds and patterns, drum patterns, and why does it always create these movements, these signature and uniform movements between people in the way that they're dancing to this music? And so I've been building, with the support of New York Live Arts as their first creative technology resident, a application where I'm studying the movement of others through this machine learning application that I'm going to show in a second, that tracks their body's placement, whether the different parts of their body. And then I am also placing in sounds that I've created, different polyrhythmic African drum pattern music, and seeing the relationship between how they move their body and the sound. And so this is a visual from that. And one thing I noticed in doing this is with me just trying it on myself, it's just the natural movement of hearing lower sounds and naturally moving your body lower. And then as you hear higher sounds, naturally moving it higher. And so now it's about seeing how other people interact with that and capturing all of that into some sort of database. And so when it comes to research and pedagogy, research, I mean, I'm bringing in all of these different elements that I've already studied of electromedia practices and race and culture and critical race theory, and then also thinking of how can I create and turn all of my research into experiences inside of the classroom, where I'm allowing other students to use the research that I've done to then build on top of that and create their own explorations. And a lot of my research, especially more recently, has been in pedagogy. I think some of my favorite, especially when it comes to pedagogy, is the work of Paulo Freire, which has also inspired Bell Hooks in teaching to transgress. There's a direct relationship between her work and Paulo's. And then also Radical Indigenism by Julia Watson, which has just been an incredible resource of learning how different indigenous practices have existed throughout time, and then also hidden life of trees, of understanding natural systems, and especially in thinking specifically about trees and these micro and macro ecologies and how they all have this sort of internet between them, especially when considering trees of, in many ways, trees are these sort of socialist beings that they take care of one another, and thinking of how all of this can then be infused into the way that we think about the world. And I think these are just really good reflections of the ways that I think about research in general, of it's never about diving very deep into this one siloed area, but similar. And I'm also very inspired by the work of Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth Catalog. And for anyone that is not familiar with the Whole Earth Catalog, people like Steve Jobs have considered it to be one of the origins of the internet, of that it was creating this central node of a bunch of different information from a variety of different spaces. Stuart Brand was very inspired by almanacs and loved how they were these sort of compilations of just a variety of different information into this one source. And so wanted to create that for his friends that were living in communes, because this was in the time of the Vietnam War and a lot of people were removing themselves from societies. And so people that are living on the communes, what can exist for them to remain somewhat connected to society, though they're not infiltrated inside of society, but to live in another world where they have, it's a self-education sort of philosophy of you can teach yourself how to build your own home or understand how to garden or these sorts of things, but all inside of a book. So the whole systems philosophy of Stuart Brand is very aligned with the way that I approach my own research practice and the work of Victor Papanek, which is seen below, The Politics of Design. And thinking very critically about the way that we're engaging with design and how where design is really the social practice and how we can make sure that we are not causing harm and oppression in the way that we do so. And then also a lot of my work in being someone that's a technologist, but also very tuned into what's going on socially and very concerned about what's going on socially, of how cybernetics and computing and counterculture and design all exist in tandem. And so inside of these works, inside of the philosophies of Victor Papanek and Stuart Catalog, is really about how everything is connected. And I'm teaching a workshop with DePaul in a couple of hours, and where we're going to continue to explore how everything really is connected. And so how can we design worlds with this sort of philosophy of omni-specialized practices? A lot of my other research has been in African fractals. Ron's work on African fractals has just been really one of my highlights of this summer, of just learning so much about the ways that modern computing and indigenous design have existed on the African continent in a variety of different ways. How, and it's been especially healing to read this book, as often the things that are socialized with things that are coming out of the African continent are considered primitive through a Eurocentric lens and gaze, but really the work that was coming out of the African continent were ahead of its time for people that were visiting, for the European colonialists that were visiting, and thinking that the way that these people were living all over the continent were in disarray, when actually it was these different fractal systems of, it wasn't about these circadian or Euclidean sort of designs of everything being on a sort of orthographical plane, but it's more of natural systems and the way that they were creating their own communities of, it's not about these straight streets, but more of power structures that naturally fractal out and outside of each other. And fractals were something that existed on the African continent and India alone before anywhere else. And more recently have Europeans and white people engage with fractals. So just this recognition of how so much intelligence and innovation has stemmed from the practices coming outside of the Afrocentric world, and even corn rolls and those being a sort of math in themselves in the way that they were created. And so what I've been doing over the summer, supported by a fellowship that I received from Ibeam, which is an art and technology fellowship in space, was thinking a lot about the research that I had done over time, and thinking about the fellowship was particularly focused with surveillance capitalism and invading surveillance capitalism. And for me, when I'm thinking of invading surveillance capitalism, I'm thinking of how the internet is so well structured to understand exactly what I want, and how there's no room, very little room for spontaneity or discovering things that I may have never come across, because it knows the way that I move through the internet. and it has all my data. So what if I could create a space that's not thinking of the internet as a sort of utilitarian tool, but it's thinking of it as an experience. And I'm thinking, and just as I've showed you books on the trees of life, or life of trees, I'm thinking a lot about biomimicry, of what kind of digital infrastructures that we have now can be more similar to the ways that we are, more similar to the natural world, of thinking of the mycelium, that's a sort of internet infrastructure inside of trees and tree roots, and communication systems that exist within trees. With trees, they have a lot of different ways to communicate, obviously not verbally, but when an animal is eating a leaf of a tree, it releases these sort of scents that lets the other trees know that this tree is in danger, and then that the animal is also repelled from continuing to eat off of that tree. So different ways of communicating by tapping into different senses, pedagogy, information, and also thinking a lot about digital architecture and psychogeography. And you saw that a bit in the metamorphosis space, of thinking of these ways of approaching the way that we navigate through the internet and digital spaces with a psychogeographical lens, but also digital architecture, especially of us being in quarantine, and most of the way that we're engaging with the real world or outside world is through the internet. What if we could tap into the potentials of the internet and create these structures similar to how we're walking down a street, but a digital form of architecture? And so in this fellowship, I did even more research and also revisited past research. So Places of the Heart has been one of my favorite in studying psychogeography. Ujamaa villages in Tanzania. So I was thinking about different social structures, and the Ujamaa villages were a social experiment out of Tanzania that was thinking about socialism, and with trees being a sort of socialist being, what's the relationship between those two? And then looking at pneumatic architectural structures in this bubble texture book, and then club culture, and just all these different sources, and thinking about how can I bring these together to create my own experiential guide in navigating my current research practice. And I'll go into that in a little bit to make more sense. But basically what I'm thinking about is the only, and in this quote I'm reading, the only humane and effective way to break the negative grip of antique culture is with information. And so constantly being able to research in a way that's not siloed, but is multidimensional and omni-specialized. A lot more is revealed than if you were to remain in one space to focus solely on chemistry and nothing else. But if you're blending chemistry and hair science and music and all of these other fields, so much more is revealed. And when you're revealing more of this information, it creates paradigm shifts for the wider community. So how can I translate this research practice into an accessible form of information that could potentially cause paradigm shifts? And then back with architecture of digital environments, I'm currently studying architecture. And the way that I'm looking at architecture outside of my academic studies is thinking about it, placing it into web VR spaces. So psychogeography of digital environments, but also thinking about biomimicry and how these structures can be reflective of natural systems. And so through Ibeam, or in my time of Ibeam, I was exploring how to translate my research practice into this immersive world and space. And so creating these virtual environments for online exploration, where inside of these virtual environments, as you're moving through, so thinking of the internet as an experience as opposed to a tool, you're entering different portals. And inside of these different portals, there are different areas of information, whether it's on the left, we have environments and Dadaism. So what's the relationship between those two? And you would be immersed in a space with a bunch of different research on that. Or quantum mechanics and sound design, what's the relationship between those two? And then I've also just been building out and sharing my research on Omni-Specialized design. And all of these slides I'll go into in the workshop later today on Omni-Specialized design and how to engage with that in creating more beautiful worlds. And in Omni-Specialized design, I'm going to move a little quicker because I'm also going to talk about Afrotopia to wrap us up. But in Omni-Specialized design, I love this quote by Benjamin Bratton of the job of design in the 21st century is to undo much of the design in the 20th. So understanding that the way that we live right now, and I think it's so top of mind in the work and action of people, especially on the streets, but people that are really questioning status quo and understanding that status quo was something that was designed by people. So it's inherently flawed. And how can we challenge status quo to make sure that we're living in a world that's healthy for us and not just comfortable for the people highest in power? And in this workshop, we'll also engage with rethinking design. So what's the role of a designer? What are the principles that we're building design off of and ways to design? and engaging with the role of the designer, I'll bring in this of how design, oftentimes we think design is like this lone wolf, it's this genius, this one being that knows all and is like this vision, carries this vision forward, but really the designer is merely a bridge between a variety of people of a variety of different people of a variety of different backgrounds, whether it's a historian or a scientist or engineer, or community member or artist. They're really just a language bridge that allows for these different groups of people to communicate with one another. And it's important that design is a very interdisciplinary practice. Otherwise, there are clear blind spots that the work will inevitably carry with it. And a big part of design is based off of the Radical Indigenism book that I shared earlier by Julia Watson, who so eloquently shares how humanism, colonialism, and racism have combined to create this mythology of design, which also produces capitalism. But really, technology is not about this hyper-productive, hyper-consumerist, hyper-exploitive, extractive sort of field, but it's really technology at its core, and in its most successful form is indigenous innovation. So groups of people that have lived on this land for centuries, how they have been able to use the land and have a mutually beneficial relationship with the land and the sentient beings around them, and ancestral intelligence and local wisdom. And so this research, this Omni-Specialized research practice also feeds into the courses that I design and teach. So this course I designed and taught at NYU's Interactive Telecommunications program called The Revolution Will Be Digitized. And so we're thinking about societal impacts of technology and how we can use technology for social empowerment. And so in this course, we're thinking about technology, ecology, economics, sociology, public policy, the military origins of the internet, which then created surveillance, ubiquitous sort of surveillance and design and politics. But then I'm also teaching a course called Designing Club Culture. So still thinking about societal impacts of tech, but not in the same vein of this is more of how different countercultural communities have used technology for their artistic expression, for freedom and sovereignty and liberation, especially in thinking about the LGBTQ communities and the Black and Latinx communities, and them creating these sort of temporary utopias and participatory theaters through club culture. And so in this class, we're thinking about electromedia and the relationship between technology's advancements and club culture's advancements and sound, and how they've been used for political purposes and so on. And so I'll wrap up by talking a bit about Afrotopia, because Afrotopia is so reflective of the way that I engage with research and pedagogy in general. And I've brought all of that into Afrotopia. And so to give some context, as far as what Afrotopia is, it's a space that I've created when I was a graduate student at NYU's Interactive Telecommunications, and being in the program and loving all that I was exposed to, but very frustrated at the lack of racial diversity within the community, of having very few Black classmates and having no Black full-time faculty, and just generally not having anyone to look up to or collaborate with or discuss the things that I was thinking about, and how often in technology spaces, race and society are kind of these add-on topics or these obligatory topics, and not seen central in the discussions on tech. So what if I could I was thinking of what if I could create a space where race is not this add-on, but it's the center. And we're thinking about technology in a sort of Afrocentric lens, and just be able to be around a whole bunch of Black people that are thinking about innovation in critical forms. And so it sold out quickly in its first year, being held in the spring of 2018. It filled a void for a lot of people. They just didn't have a space to come to. For one, to think about technology in creative forms. Oftentimes we think about technology in very scientific and maybe data-driven, but it's not thinking about it as an expressive tool, an artistic expressive tool, but also just to be in a space with Black people that are thinking about tech and society in critical ways. And our spring festival had a variety of different people from a bunch of different backgrounds. And so again, with my Omni-Specialized design research practice, it's also about creating spaces that are very welcoming and inviting for people of all different backgrounds. Oftentimes when tech events exist, they're very hyper-focused on the tech and driving the tech and knowing what softwares and libraries, but it's not inclusive of other people. And so it creates a very siloed space. And Afrotopia has grown to host a summer camp, which was held in 2019, and also holds a second festival at Google in New York City, a School of Afrotopia in January of this year, which was hosted by Verizon Media. And then more recently, we launched an Imagineer Fellowship where we had 10 different fellows
engaging with them for 6 weeks and $1,000 stipend each. And this fellowship was created. I'll talk about why it was created, what we did, and the goals quickly. For one, it was a fellowship that was central in thinking about individualism versus community. Of oftentimes fellowships, the way that they're designed is you give a lump sum of money to this artist or innovator and they go off in their own world and they create and then they come back and present their work. But there's oftentimes not much of an engagement with the community and they're just this lone wolf. So thinking of with Afrotopia being such a collaborative and community driven space, what if this fellowship is in that similar ethos and it creates a space for community-driven engagement. And so in interviewing and curating and selecting the different fellows, it was about making sure that we have Black creators that are coming from so many different fields and making sure that Afrotopia is not just seen as this tech in a very specific way, but tech in a variety of different ways. And so the fellows, they had skills in intergroup communication, urban planning, architecture, machine learning, game design, social justice, writing, poetics, etc. And also recognizing that Blackness is not a monolith. And oftentimes when we think of Blackness, we think it's just this unified experience, but really Black people can be inside this larger culture, but have so many subcultures within it. And so tapping into that, for one, with the different ethnicities that the fellows had. So these ethnicities, the fellows were coming from one from all over the country. So from every part of the country, from Southwest to Northeastern to West Coast, but also outside of the country. So we had people from Accra, Ghana, the UK, France, Paris, who also was studying in the Netherlands. And then also their different cultural backgrounds. So Haitian, Afro-Cuban, Mexican-American, and so on. And their perspectives of being beyond just even their cultural, like ethnicity, but also sexuality. So people of different sexualities, queer, fluid, non-binary, and then also geographical locations, and then different socioeconomic standards. We had working class and upper class and a variety of different Black people. And then also in creating this space for the fellows, it was about making sure that they understood that when it comes to Afrotopia, it's not technology for tech's sake. It's technology. It's recognizing that technology is merely an extension of human capability. And getting outside of this human-centric way of engaging with design, technology is merely an extension of sentient capability. So it's understanding that technology is not something that only humans use, but it's every living thing is using it and finding a way to make their lives easier through technologies. And technology is not synonymous with digitality, but technology is merely just an extension. And so I went over the fellows and the objectives being to build a micro-community of imaginative innovators and collaboratively design healthy Black futures, and to make sure that all the research that we were doing was being shared and open source. And so we produced a syllabus. We had Imaginariums that complemented the Imagineer Fellows. So the Imaginariums were open to the entire Black public. Anyone that was Black that wanted to engage in the space, they could. It was free. And the Imaginariums were allowing the Black public to engage with the similar research that the Imagineers were doing. And so here's some footage from the Imaginariums of people would enter this digital space. I would bring in a speaker that was in relation to whatever we were focusing on at the time, this one being Black Futures Manifesto, but we also talked about inventing Black radical technoculture. And so the different speakers would come and share their work, and then the participants in the Imaginariums would break up into smaller groups. That would allow them to get to know each other better, but also they could have more intimate and personal conversations in relation to the theme for that week, and then use mural board to write down their ideas. And as they're in their little breakout spaces, they could see the work of the entire group, even if they weren't talking to them or had access to them. And then we would come together for a collective conversation, which was I always left these so inspired and admiring of the entire community and their brilliance and all the things that they would think of, whether it was directly related to the topic or we would go off in completely other directions, but leaving that space for just imagination. And so the goals, as I mentioned, to build a community, to contribute to Black healthy futures, to develop open source interdisciplinary pedagogy, and to build out these projects. We had a series of different projects, from future protests to designing future cities and building our syllabus. And in the way that we structured the Imagineer Fellowship of starting off reflecting on the reading that we engage with in our syllabus, and that giving some context as far as the work that we would develop throughout the day, And so guest presenters would come in for specifically the Imagineer Fellows that were also in relation to the work. So we had here Rafael Sergio Sadiq, who is a design director at IDEO, talking about his sketches, one being solar powered reparations. And so this would allow to inspire the fellows and think of different ways that people that were out in the field were engaging with these different works. And then they release their work. In the last slide, you see in the bottom, dissemination of finding ways to visually translate the work that the fellow had done on social media so that other people can engage with the work that they've done and use it in their own practice. And then the fellows also each produced their own essays in relation to the work that they did inside the fellowship. So these were both personal, but also extremely speculative and research driven. These are the worlds that they're imagining and that they're able to carry with them after having been in the fellowship. And so the main goal was to plant seeds for radical imagination, which is always hard to assess in tangible ways. It's a very sentimental kind of transaction, but it's realizing the importance of that, of just being able to create spaces where we can just imagine and manifest these worlds. And so I'll leave you with two philosophies for me that's really important of just it's important to always create space for imagination. As you do that, it's inevitably becoming manifestation, and that everything is fluid and that there are no silos. So thank you.